This is Tracy Carluccio. I'm with Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and we also have Karen Ferridan from Berks Gas Truth, and we're both presenting this webinar tonight. It's the second in our series on the DRBC's draft fracking regulations and proposed ban on fracking in the Delaware River watershed. Tonight we're going to be focusing on the section of the draft fracking regulations that address water. The goal of this series of webinars is to prepare everybody for the hearings that are coming up, January 23rd and 25th, February 22nd, and March 6th, which is a telephone opportunity. And we'll be talking a little more about that. But to start off, we want to emphasize how important this draft regulation and proposed ban process is, because whether or not fracking is completely banned in the watershed is going to be decided in the coming months. And the decision is really going to define our future and the future of our watershed and what our future generations are going to inherit from the watershed. This is probably the biggest policy decision made by the DRBC since in modern times. So what is the DRBC doing? Well, the Delaware River Basin Commission has a de facto fracking moratorium in place. It's been in place since 2010, and it's come under attack by industry. The governors of the 4 states whose streams flow to the Delaware, that's Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, will be deciding whether to completely ban it or whether or not to adopt a set of regulations that would allow some of fracking's related activities. What's the next step? Well, the DRBC posted draft regulations on November 30th for public comment. Proposed is a ban on high-volume hydraulic fracturing throughout the Delaware River Basin, but they also issued draft regulations that allow the export of water from the watershed for fracking and the storage, processing, and discharge of frack wastewater within the basin. How they could possibly do this and propose such an illogical second step is perplexing to all of us who have been fighting for a ban for several years now. But that's the story that we're left with at this moment in time. Last week, our webinar addressed why we need to support the proposal to ban fracking and to make the strongest record possible. Just because they propose to ban fracking in all gas-bearing formations doesn't mean they're going to do it. So we need to step up and explain and put on the record all of the harms that fracking is causing where it's occurring. We talked about that last week, and we have a talking points document on our website that covers those issues. This week, we're going to talk about the water withdrawal draft rule, and next week we'll be looking at the frack wastewater rule. I just want to take a minute here to recap what has happened to now having to do with the public participation process. We argued for really big changes in the public participation process because of the really extremely limited opportunities for people to give input into these monumentally important draft regulations. After public onslaught, the DRBC did extend the public comment period from February 28th to March 30th. Now, we wanted 180 days. That's 120 days. It's not what we asked for, but it is helpful to have another month. It will allow more people to participate in the process and allow everybody to develop more substantive comments. Also, they added 2 verbal testimony opportunities. One is, believe it or not, another hearing in Pennsylvania. Now, it's not that we don't want hearings in Pennsylvania, but both of the hearings in January are in Pennsylvania, one in Philadelphia, one in Wayne County and Waymart, and now they put one in Schnecksville, Pennsylvania, in the Lehigh Valley. So we wanted to have at least one, and actually one in every major region in the 4 states that drain to the Delaware. But it is important that we did get 2 other hearings, and people around that area in Schnecksville will be able to go to that hearing. And the telephone session on March 6th, I wouldn't call that a hearing. It sounds more like a town meeting, but it will allow people to participate without investing resources like they have to go to the hearings. Many people will be traveling at, an hour or 2, or some people up to 4 hours to get to a hearing. So you have to, pay for the travel, and then there's no easy way to get there either of the places by public transportation. So it's a big pain. You have to do it either during a work day or early or in the evening. There's not enough opportunity at times when people are not at work. So, and then the written comment restrictions are so restrictive that if you don't have access to internet, you're basically cut out of the process altogether. They're not even accepting written comment by the U.S. Post Office mail. No email. You have to go through their portal on their website. But we did file a letter that was signed by many of you and your organizations. 109 organizations protested, and that's why they did add these other opportunities and loosened up some of the restrictions about how you can get into a hearing and speak. The written public comment period closes, remember, on March 30th at 5 p.m., and we did provide a website where you'll be able to it's a Facebook event where you'll be able to keep up with all of the opportunities that exist. Okay, so moving on, for some reason I can't use my, I can't move this slide. Okay, what do we know? We know drilling and fracking cannot be done safely, and no matter how, quote unquote, well it is regulated. The weight of evidence shows that fracking and its related activities pollute, and they gravely harm human health and the environment, and that body of evidence is growing as we speak. We know the public opposes fracking, and we know that we don't need shale gas to meet our energy needs. To achieve a complete and permanent ban on fracking and all its activities, however, we still need to make that case for the DRBC record. So we went over this last week, but I quickly do want to go over it just to give some context, particularly if people were not on last week's. We're talking about the Delaware River watershed here. So that's about 13,000 square miles. The river is 330 miles long. The east and west branches join at Hancock, New York, and form the main stem river. And then it flows along New York and Pennsylvania. It flows past New Jersey and Delaware and into the Delaware Bay and then into the Atlantic Ocean. It is a national wild and scenic river. It was the second national wild and scenic river designated by Congress, and it is a national estuary because of outstanding resources there. The Delaware is the largest free-flowing river east of the Mississippi. There's a lot of blood on the walls throughout the watershed and for people who fought to keep this river free-flowing. And thanks to them, groups like Save the Delaware and some of the early environmental warriors upriver on the Delaware, we still have a free-flowing river, and we have a diversity of biological diversity, a diversity of fish life, vegetation, and aquatic resources that we would not have if we were not a free-flowing river. Up to 17 million people drink Delaware River water. They rely on it, and that includes up to 9 million people in New York City, and also Philadelphia and the Philadelphia region. And all of us have no place else to go in order to get water. So it's a source of water that's irreplaceable. The Delaware River Basin Commission has adopted special protection waters in response to a petition filed by Delaware Riverkeeper Network, their first one in 1990 for the upper part of the Delaware, and then again in 2000 for the rest of the Delaware. So the non-tidal Delaware is the longest stretch of anti-degradation waters in the nation. And that prohibits the degradation of the water quality of the Delaware. That is one of the main reasons that we are certain that fracking cannot occur here, because they are required not to allow the water quality of the Delaware to measurably change downward. And if it does change, it has to change towards healthy natural conditions. Now, quickly again, the proposed ban would ban high-volume hydraulic fracturing and all hydrocarbon-bearing rock formations. So that includes the deep formations like Marcellus and Utica shales, and they define high volume as using more than 300,000 gallons of water during all stages of well drilling. You can see a map here that shows the Delaware River boundary, and it's overlain in that tan color is the Marcellus shale formation. I think everybody knows what hydraulic fracturing or fracking is, but it is you take the water, you mix chemical and proppants with it, you inject it under high pressure down a well bore that's drilled vertically and then horizontally, and then those fractures release natural gas that flows from the fissures back into the well bore. It comes up the well bore with flowback and produced water, which is together are called wastewaters, and then that has to be disposed of at waste treatment or waste disposal facilities such as injection wells according to the Clean Water Act. So what did DRBC's draft regulations say about water for fracking? Well, they're changing these parts that I have up there, 440.4 and 401.35. And this is basic. It's not very long, but this is basically what they say. The diversion, transfer, or exportation of water from sources within the basin to support hydraulic fracturing outside of the basin is, quote unquote, discouraged. And I give the citation to the water code on that so you have it. And the transfer of any amount of surface or groundwater, treated wastewater, or mine drainage water for fracking, and that means not only high volume hydraulic fracturing and what they say for any fracking, outside of the basin requires DRBC approval. So they don't say you can't do it, as we know, but they do say that it requires their approval. DRBC supplied supplementary information with the draft regulations. And this is what they say about water withdrawals, or as they call it, acquisition. They say that it could result in changes to groundwater levels, surface water levels, and stream flows. The DRBC says that water levels, water withdrawals for volumes needed for fracking may adversely affect aquatic ecosystems, river channel and riparian resources. Those are the resources along a waterway. They could affect wetlands, could affect assimilative capacity of a stream or aquifers due to diminished quantity. And that means if you have less fresh water to dilute pollutants, then you're reducing the capacity of the stream to absorb those pollutants. So not that the solution to pollution is dilution, but if you have more fresh water, then you have a cleaner stream and it can absorb pollutants better. And they also say it can upset the balance between demand and availability of water resources for protected uses. And they call protected uses those that are named in their comprehensive plan, such as water supply diversions. And they point out that this is especially during drought and periods of low flow. The Delaware has drought and low flow declarations fairly often. So DRBC supplementary information states these facts, that the Susquehanna River Basin Commission reports 4.3 million gallons of water average use per well for fracking. Now remember that, I was going to talk about it a little bit later. They say 84% of the water that was used was what they call fresh water. That means water without anything added to it. And they say 16% was recycled or produced water, or what they call flowback water. And that was from a frack at a previous well, and then they put it through a minimal type of treatment system in order to remove constituents that they think might interfere with their frack job, and then they add fresh water to it. The DRBC states that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency reports that between 2011 and 2013, the median amount that was used was 4.18 million gallons of water per well in Pennsylvania. So it's a little different, but these numbers are important, and as I said, we're going to talk about it in a couple slides from now. In at least 10% of the cases, over 6.6 million gallons was used per well in Pennsylvania. In other words, there are some wells that use more water, and we're going to talk about why. So, and according to the EPA, up to like 82 to 90% of the water used in the Marcellus and PA was fresh water, and 10 to 18% was reused or recycled water. They also state that the SRBC reports that when horizontal well bores were beginning to be lengthened in 2013, the average per fracking event was 5.1 to 6.5 million gallons of water. So the numbers were going up, and that's important. Now, they also say in their supplementary information, and this is important because you can bring this up and put it right into their faces as part of your comment at the public hearings, that water used for fracking is used consumptively. In other words, it's not returned to the basin's usable ground and surface waters. That's their definition of consumptively. They state that the EPA reports that 90 to 90% of the frac fluids that are injected down a well are water. The rest is chemicals. Produced water makes up 10 to 30% of the fluid that's injected. So that means that reused water from the prior frac well. Produced water is water that flows from and through oil and gas wells to the surface, so you know exactly, as a byproduct of oil and gas production, so you know exactly what they're talking about when they say produced water. And 70 to 90% of the water injected for fracking is permanently removed from the water cycle. We're going to explain a little more what that means. They also state that the DRBC reports that 96% of the water withdrawn for fracking is used consumptively, and the rest is used at the well pad or for related activities like washing down the well pad or dust suppression on the roads that they build to get in, all sorts of uses on the well pad are having to do with the development of the site. DRBC, in contrast, considers 90% of the water withdrawn for domestic and commercial use to be returned to the source. So they've never had this world where so much water that's taken out for a use is used consumptively. They typically see most water returned that is taken out for domestic and commercial use. This is a different world for them. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Karen, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the volumes of water that are used for fracking and why that's so important.
Thanks, Tracy, and thanks everybody for getting on the call tonight. So you just heard Tracy talking about the DRBC, and that's the Susquehanna River Basin Commission numbers that the DRBC uses. They also cite EPA. So estimates for water used per well from 2008 to 2013, to recap, is 4.3 million gallons on average. Well, Dr. Ted Ock over at Frack Tracker Alliance has been working on, he's been studying water use, he's been studying wastewater, and you can see a citation at the bottom of the page there that points to his report. But in 2016, he did this report where he indicated that 8 to 12% increase in lateral length is occurring each year since 2013 in wells and major shale plays. So we're seeing this increase in length. In addition to that, and as a result of that, you're seeing an increase in the amount of water used per fracked well, and that is 9.7 million gallons on average. And that's increasing at a rate of 11% per year in the Marcellus today. So that 9.7 million gallons per on average is what's currently happening as a result of having grown 11% per year in the Marcellus. But there are other laterals that have become so long they're considered superlaterals. And some of these superlaterals are 2 to 4 miles longer, or 2 to 4 miles in length. In other words, we've heard forever that when you go down and you drill vertically and then you turn the drill bit and go horizontally, they're able to drill 2 miles a lateral well bore. But now they're extending that, and some of these laterals are as much as 4 miles long. And so when you're trying to frack a well that long, you need a whole lot more water. And so we're seeing water demands increasing. In an outlier that Dr. Alex pointed to, he had calculated that up to 87 million gallons of water were used per superlateral well. So that's a strange, high number. It's crazy, but it's still the outlier. Nevertheless, no matter where they're drilling, they're using more water. The increase is occurring, and that's a really, really important thing to note, as Tracy said earlier. So I'm going to turn it back to Tracy to go into more detail.
Thank you, Karen. And please, if you have any questions that are being raised as we go along, you can go ahead and write them right into the chat box. I see some people are doing that, and that's great because we're going to go to Q&A at the end of this. So again, let's look a little further at the volumes of water. So one of the things that Dr. Ock found out and reported in his paper is that wells with less gas production require greater volumes of water and more proppants. That is usually silica sand that's mined out west and brought to the well site to prop open the fissures that are fracked. So in the Delaware River Basin, we often hear, oh, well, you know, we have baked shales here, and they're not that great of gas producers, and, you know, even if we allow it, no one will come. Well, in fact, it turns out that some of these wells that are on the edges that are in areas that don't have great gas production are being fracked, and they tend to require greater volumes of water and greater amounts of proppants. So we're talking about increasing the amount of water, not decreasing it, if you get into areas of less gas production like we may have here in the Delaware River watershed. At 10 to 20 million gallons of water per well, the demand for water impinges on other uses in the watershed. It starts becoming really a rival for water, and such as our domestic uses, existing industrial uses, recreational uses. And when you start adding these volumes up and they rival these other uses, it's unsustainable to allow water withdrawal. Greater volumes of water per well require more intense transfers. And what we mean by that is more truck trips. Sometimes the water is moved by pipeline. Sometimes it's moved by truck. You can go from, and in the talking points that we sent out, you'll see we have some numbers in there, but you can go from 1,400 truck trips per well to 2,200 truck trips per well to get the water and the sand into the well site for one frack job. So we're talking about much more intense transfers. And, you know, folks, I think it's not an accident that water export is being considered by the DRBC. When they introduced this concept at the September meeting of the Delaware River Basin Commission, the executive director said, well, we're making these regulations for water and wastewater because we don't have anything in place. And, you know, off to the side, he said to the different people from the press, they're not going to come here anyway. Who would come over to the Delaware River watershed? Well, we believe that this is a plan, and that, in fact, the industry needs now more water, and they want it cheaply, and they want it where they are. So the super wells and the sweet spots right on the edge of the Delaware River watershed in Susquehanna County, or Cabot in Dimock, for instance, Dimock, Pennsylvania, has some of the highest producing wells in the state. Those areas, those sweet spots are going to need more and more water as they put in these longer laterals. And we're in their backyard. So they want to come over the border and take the water from here because they're draining the water from where they are. What does this mean for the Delaware River watershed? Well, increased water demand means the likelihood of a water raid on the basin. And this demand is much greater than is predicted by the DRBC estimates because they're talking about, remember in those earlier slides, 4.3 million gallons on average per well, according to the SRBC, 4.1 million gallons per well, according to the EPA. And we're talking now at least between 5 and 10, and really more realistically between 10 and 20 as the new wells go in. The amount of water needed, as I mentioned, for these neighboring sweet spots is going to continue to grow too, because that's where drilling, if you look at where the permits are and where the wells are going in, they're concentrating really in two major areas in the state now. And that's northeastern PA, just on the outside of the Delaware River watershed, and moving into the Susquehanna River watershed towards central Pennsylvania, and in southwestern Pennsylvania, where they have the wet gas. So frack gas wells with longer well bores are also going to increase greater volumes of wastewater, something to note for our webinar next week, and also more drill cuttings, more waste solids. People in New York are suffering because their landfills are being inundated, some of them, with drill cuttings from fracking in Pennsylvania. There are drill cuttings being taken to other states, and these waste solids and drill cuttings that are going to processing facilities, injection wells, and landfills now are going to increase in number because of these longer well bores. It's something for us to keep in mind. The Delaware River watershed, remember, has both Marcellus and Utica shales. And that's important because the Utica shale, according to the information from Ted Auck in Ohio, is using typically more than the Marcellus. It's deeper, and they've been using more water in those wells. Drought and low precipitation periods in the Delaware River watershed will become more severe. And we know that is happening as a result of climate change trends. Scientists have done analysis about how we're overusing our water resources today, and they say that dry periods and drought periods are going to become more common than they have been in the past. And yes, we get terrible storms too, but it seems like we have the extremes. We have extreme drought, and then we have extreme storms. So that is going to become more severe in terms of the stress on the Delaware River, because we already experience droughts, and already a huge amount of the river is taken from the headwaters through reservoirs to feed the needs of New York City. DRBC's comprehensive plan protects certain uses, and it's important if you want to look at the DRBC comprehensive plan, and we have a link earlier in the slideshow. You can look at that and you can see what they are, and you may want to bring them up in comments when you speak at the hearing or when you write your written comment. So what are, we'll take a little more look here at what are the impacts of water extraction and export. Well, ecological and seasonal flow regimes are disrupted, and that means that habitats are degraded, and the species that live in those streams are negatively impacted. And I'm just going to give a little bit of information on this, not too much, but just so you have a little background on it. The DRBC regulates withdrawals from streams with the use of what's called a pass-by flow, and that is to limit the amount of water that can be withdrawn, and it's supposed to protect the streams from being overdrawn. However, a pass-by flow that is based on using the Q710, which is what the DRBC uses, the flow which occurs for a period of 7 consecutive days, one time in 10 years, also called the drought flow. They add a percent to that, and they call that the pass-by flow. But it is not adequate to protect waterways and the life that depends on them, and can actually be expected to cause direct harm to the habitats and the water quality of the stream. And there's a very good link here in Stream Flows report in the talking points that will give you more information on that. But basically, using the Q710 allows the stream flow to be artificially flattened because the natural flow regime and the seasonality of that will be disrupted and potentially eliminated. And ecological flow analysis of the waterway really should be required to measure the natural variation of the waterway's flows in terms of how much water is in there, but also the rate it flows, the temperature of the water, the stream structure, and the quality. And all of that is what's called an ecological flow. And that analysis should be completed before any withdrawal of surface water in order to provide an ecologically based flow regime that will give needed protection to the habitats and the species that live there. For instance, the dwarf wedge mussel, an endangered species in the main stem Delaware, requires a certain amount of ripples and flows over the shells in order to be able to be kept healthy. That supplies oxygen and keeps them, their habitat healthy, and allows them to live in the Delaware. And that's what gets disrupted. If you start making changes where you're taking off the spring flows or and flattening that flow, or you're always taking it except when it drops below this arbitrary pass-by flow, you're removing all the natural ups and downs of the stream that the species who live there have adapted to. So you're threatening those species. And another point that's really important is that water withdrawals have the potential to deplete downstream groundwater resources. And in the bullet point on this slide, I talk about shallow groundwater and aquifer diminishment. And what we're talking about there is the fact that if you don't take seasonality into account, and if you don't consider the importance of refilling your groundwater resources when you have those spring flows or in high, like storm events, for instance, then you are not allowing those aquifers to fill up as they naturally would. So such a withdrawal may downstream cause, because of the withdrawals upstream, could cause additional discharge from the aquifer to make up for the loss of the stream flow. In other words, as is explained by hydrogeologist Peter D'Amico, when you have a stream that's flowing and it doesn't have enough water in it, it will discharge from the shallow groundwater or even from the deep water aquifers to the surface in order to make up for that flow. And that's a natural occurrence that happens. But if you are artificially keeping that stream low, then you could de-water or diminish the amount of water in your aquifers downstream, and just to meet the base flow of the stream. And it's something that is not considered by the Delaware River Basin Commission. They actually began studying seasonal flows. They stopped doing that several years back, and we think that there's absolutely no way that they could allow additional large withdrawals from the Delaware for any purpose without kick-starting and reinstating that ecological flow regime and looking at every stream and what lives there and figuring out what can the habitat tolerate in terms of water removal, not using this artificial pass-by. So I probably spent enough time on that, but I think it's an important point, especially if you want to talk about protecting our aquifers and groundwater. Also, your stream morphology changes. If, for instance, the riparian corridor, the areas along the stream, which has trees, is heavily forested, it's used to having a certain amount of water to draw from in order to remain healthy. And if you start moving that amount of water downwards, if you start diminishing that flow because you're withdrawing it upstream, even if you have a pass-by flow, you could impact those species. You could cause trees to die, you could cause vegetation to change, and then you could cause the cascading effects that accompany that, such as sedimentation, erosion, and stream side collapse, and all of the morphology changes that lead to degradation of stream and life in the stream. Also, wetlands and other hydrologically connected natural features are disrupted when you take water out and take it away. And these are wetlands and the other features that I'm talking about, such as open ponds or springs and seeps. Those express to the surface as wetlands do because of a certain balance in the hydrologic system beneath them and connected to them. And if you start withdrawing water from a waterway or an aquifer and not bringing it back, removing it from the source completely, you can drain those wetlands. And that is one of the things that even DRBC admits. They don't explain it, but it is definitely impact, and we have a little more information on that, again, in the talking points. You also, as I mentioned earlier, and because they put it into their supplemental information, when you have less fresh water, you don't have enough water to dilute pollutants. So we're still going to have the inputs of pollutants along the way from every use, agriculture, just even recreational use, all of the uses, people with lawns, that go up to the edge of the river, any use along our waterways, all the stormwater runoff that comes from developed areas and impervious surfaces, they contribute pollution, even if you don't have a point discharge like from a pipe from an industry, which there's not a lot of upstream. But if you have less fresh water to dilute those pollutants, then you have a dirtier river, and your water quality goes downhill. And then also the other point is, and I think it's really good for people to make this point, water depletion is unrecoverable. Water is lost forever to the hydrologic cycle. This is different than other industrial uses or even agricultural uses. For instance, when you irrigate with agriculture or maybe on a golf course or even a power plant, that water evaporates, it goes up into the atmosphere and comes back as precipitation. This water that's taken away, and remember, we're talking about 80 to 90% of the water that's injected being locked down or sequestered down in those deep formations. When that water is taken away, it's taken out of the hydrologic cycle. So the impact is all the more greater than if you just took it out and then returned it to the source. The other point that's really important is how are they going to get the water out? And we need to consider, and they don't even mention this in the regulations, that they're going to build new infrastructure. They're going to build pipelines. They're going to have to, of course, put in pumping stations in order to take the water out. We've reviewed some of these before when Exxon's XTO tried to come into the Aquaga Creek and put in a water withdrawal. When Stone Energy tried to put in a water withdrawal in the west branch of the Lackalakson. We have seen these before, and they're big footprints on the landscape, these water pumping stations. And then they have a pipeline. Or if they don't have a pipeline, they have large parking lots and loading stations for trucks. If they do have a pipeline, they offload eventually from the pipeline to a truck, and then they move into the well. Actually, in parts of Pennsylvania where companies have very large leaseholds, they're actually connecting their water sources and their wells by pipelines. These pipelines are not regulated like interstate gas pipelines, for instance, and they have much less regulation than even a water line does under Pennsylvania DEP regulation. DRBC does not have robust regulations for pipelines. They do minimal review for pipelines. We're fighting for much more, as many of you know, but they do not give the kind of review that would protect the watershed from the intrusion of pipelines and pumping stations and truck transport of this water out of our watershed. And, of course, all of the other devastating impacts that happen to streams as a result of pipelines and the riparian areas, all the cutting through of forests and the compaction of soils and the destruction of habitats and water quality, all of that comes with any new water pipeline. So at this point, we want to turn to some of our questions. And I do want to say that this is part of our January 2018 series of webinars. And it's really all about achieving a complete and permanent ban on gas drilling, fracking, and related activities throughout the watershed, and we're going to get there. We believe we're going to get there. But we have to make our case, and we have to make it clearly and strongly. We have to stay on point and focus everything that we say to the DRBC based on water resources. For instance, if you want to talk about air, you have to talk about air emissions, for instance, and the negative impacts of air emissions from fracking, and that's why we need to ban it. Then you need to connect that to the DRBC and explain what is the connection between air pollution and water resources. And of course those connections are there, but you have to make that connection in order for them to consider it relevant and listen to you. Same thing with climate change. We have a bullet point on the talking points about climate change and methane releases. You need to connect greenhouse gases and climate change to water resources, and of course the connection is there, but you have to connect those dots for them. You have to draw the conclusions for them to show why it's important. So any comment that you make needs to directly affect and be pointed at their mandate, which is to the management of the water resources of the Delaware River watershed. So at this point, Karen and I are open for questions, and we see that several of them are here. Oh, I see some people are talking about wastewater. We did not cover wastewater yet. That's for next week, so that's why there really is very little on wastewater in the talking points yet. As you can see, I did put a note in there that we will be putting voluminous comments on wastewater and all of the chemicals and the dangerous radioactive properties, all of the hydrocarbons and BTEX and all of that is in wastewater, all of the harms that are happening because of the elephant in the middle of the room, wastewater. The industry doesn't know what to do with it. The government doesn't know what to do with it. That's why we're not addressing. So if there's any questions, I see there's a couple about wastewater. That'll be next week. Karen, did you want to add anything to that?
I just wanted to make a general comment about preparing your comments, because there is always great information. But as Tracy said at the outset, just talking about the structure of these hearings, they're not going to let you mail in comments unless you make special arrangements. They're also not going to let you go to the hearing and hand them your comments. And so some people may be tempted to just go in and speak extemporaneously, but it's really a good idea because they're going to limit the time to jot everything down. Make sure you have something that you can read, even if you can't hand it to them afterwards, because obviously, just based on what Tracy told you, Nate, there's an awful lot of information out there, and there's going to be so much more, like Tracy just said, on the fracking wastewater issue. So try to cram as much as you can into your brief comment that you're allowed to give.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Even though they were not letting us hand in written comments at the hearing, if you write them down ahead, you're more likely going to get your bang for your buck out of the 2 or 3 minutes we end up getting. I do see there's a comment here about the USGS report about Delaware River Basin water usage from 1997 to 2000. I think it's good to look at that. I would say that is out of date. There is a really good report, which is one of the references in the talking points that you got for this webinar tonight, and that's by Gerald Kaufman of the University of Delaware. He looks at the socioeconomic value of the Delaware River Basin in the 4 states that drain to the Delaware, and he does some really good analysis in there of how the water is used and the value of that water. So I would suggest that that's an alternative place to get some really good information. Karen, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Okay, I'm looking to see other questions. There's also some questions about the carcinogenic chemicals that are used. Like I said, we're going to be talking about that next week. There are definitely, I think the latest report I saw is that up to 30% of the chemicals that are used in fracking are either likely or confirmed carcinogens. So it really depends on the particular formula they're using, but there are carcinogens used. A couple of the big ones are formaldehyde, methanol, benzene. So there's another question here: what communities have been hit hardest by the negative impacts of fracking? Karen, I'm going to turn that over to you, but so I have a bit of a cold and I've been coughing. I'm going to put myself on mute and cough, but all of Pennsylvania where fracking is concentrated is suffering terribly. But Karen, maybe you can talk a little bit about the water complaints that we do know about.
Yeah, there have been, and this we know from Public Herald, in the first decade or 12 years really of fracking, they were able to look at all of the complaints that went into the DEP, and there were more than 9,000 of them all told, but of those, more than 4,000 were water complaints. And yet, if you look on the DEP's website right now here in just Pennsylvania, you will see that they have made positive determinations in 301 cases. And I didn't look today to see if that number's gone up, but the most recent number as of last week's webinar was 301. And that doesn't mean 301 wells. It doesn't even mean 301 families, because some people share wells. Some of the letters of determination that they issued referred to multiple cases. Nevertheless, if you added all of it up, I guarantee you that 301 letters of determination does not equal the answers to 4,000 plus complaints. So there are lots of complaints that have gone unaddressed, in other words, and we definitely know that there are places in the state that have gone without determinations for several years, like the Woodlands in Butler County, Pennsylvania, where families there have gone without water for 7 years now. And so they're still relying on water from volunteers who deliver it to them at a church. So that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with huge sort of unknown quantity when we're talking about what has actually happened to the water. We know the bad things we know about that have been reported and have been confirmed by the DEP, but there are so many complaints that have just never even risen to the surface, or other communities that are perpetually in limbo, like the Woodlands. And so I think we know obviously of places like Dimmock and places that have been very profoundly impacted that have gotten a lot of news, but when the Flint water crisis was going on in Michigan, it kept going through my mind that we have Flints all over Pennsylvania. We have some version of that where there are these unreported or unaddressed problems that have been festering for a very long time. It's just they're not as concentrated as a problem like the one in Flint, but they are certainly overlooked by the government in the way that Flint was. And so, it's important to make the case that all of these things have that upstream impact on all of the people who are already suffering, that, if we're letting water get into the mix from our river basin, it's only going to allow for more fracking to go on elsewhere. So while we're fighting for our own ban, we're also fighting to not enable more fracking going on everywhere else. Tracy, are you done coughing?
Yes, I am. Yeah, thank you very much, Karen. Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because one of the reasons that our campaign coalition is so opposed to the export of water and the import of wastewater from fracking is because we're actually then enabling fracking to continue in other areas. And that is immoral. It's really unethical, and we don't support that. So thank you very much for that informative answer, Karen. Somebody asked about whether or not there's any reports or studies that are showing the effect of the diminishment of water for fracking because of the loss to the hydrologic cycle. And first, I'd like to say that Delaware Riverkeeper Network has engaged several experts in different areas of science to analyze these regulations and to provide comments that we will be putting on the record through a comprehensive comment that we'll be filing. And one of the experts is looking at that very issue and will be providing the most recent science. But overall, I do know that because it's not required that that measurement be taken, it's pretty much a blind spot for agencies. USGS does have some gauges. Because of cutbacks years back, they removed many of them, but they do have some gauges. And the Delaware River Basin Commission does have data on flows, but there is not an analysis, for instance, in Pennsylvania, to measure what is the removal of the water doing to the aquifers. They do not require surface water monitoring downstream of sites, for instance. They don't require the measurement of static water levels in monitoring wells around frac sites. This is just not something that's required. Through a clean water campaign in Pennsylvania for the last 15 years, Delaware Riverkeeper Network, Berks, Gas Truth, and a lot of other organizations have fought to try to get those regulations in place to protect communities and the environment where fracking is occurring. But the fracking rules in Pennsylvania are written for the industry. I'm sorry to say it, but the fact is they do control what's going on. And the rules that are in place have been really directly influenced by what the industry will tolerate. And that kind of measurement, that kind of scientific analysis that we would get if those measurements were required would be gold, but we don't have it. So it's sort of like out of sight, out of mind, and ignorance is bliss, but it isn't true. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That was John Locke, I think, that said that. And the truth is, these are the things that go on, the death by 1,000 cuts, that then build up to really denigrating and destroying our environment, just like we talked about last week with aquifers being destroyed by fracking. And it may happen in 5 years or 10 years, but it will definitely ruin the environment and our aquifer and water resources for the next generation. So also I see here what protections, if any, are provided by the river under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. We did talk about this a little earlier, but the Special Protection Waters program that is in place at the Delaware River Basin Commission, it was established when Delaware Riverkeeper Network filed a petition in 1990, and then it was established in 1992 for the upper and middle Delaware, and then when the lower Delaware became wild and scenic, we filed a petition in 2000 to have that included in the Special Protection Waters program. That program is modeled on the Clean Water Act's Outstanding Basin Waters provision. And if you have a wild and scenic river designation, then you can adopt these stricter regulations which require no measurable change except towards natural conditions. And that's what the DRBC did when we actually filed for ONRW, this Outstanding Natural Resource Waters designation under the Clean Water Act. They did their own version called Special Protection Waters. But that's why we have the strong anti-degradation requirements in place that accompany Special Protection Waters because of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. If you don't have that designation, or if you're not a national park, that's the other thing, our national parks also can get that designation, then you are not eligible to have this stricter threshold that's above the minimum standards that other places have to follow. Okay, so we're excuse me, we're at 7:30, and Karen, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you covered everything really well. I'm just seeing that last question asked about what are some of the most carcinogenic chemicals that are likely to wind up in the watersheds and fracking, and I'm wondering if that's something that you'll be talking about next week.
Yes, we'll be talking about that next week, and I also want to point out that in the talking points we sent out last week, there was information. Somebody was saying, you know, what about scientific and legal citations to support the Halliburton loophole problem? And we do explain that, and there are citations in there. And many of those citations are entire books. Like there's a really good explanation done by NRDC and another one by Earthworks about those exemptions. And when you go to those books, they have pages of references. So many of the citations that we give are really just a window into a world of information. So I would suggest you look at those. If you need more, get in touch with us. But there really is a whole host of information at many of these citations and references and links that we have in the talking points. The talking points from last week were repeated in the front part of the talking points for this week. So you should have all of that in the talking points. And I think that Matt posted the link. You can get it online as well if you didn't get it in your email. If you signed up after about 4 o'clock today to attend the webinar, you wouldn't have gotten an attachment with a PDF of those talking points. So I think we're pretty much at the end. Our next, as Karen mentioned, next week we're tackling frac waste processing and discharge and how the Delaware River Basin Commission draft fracking regulations address that. So that's next Thursday, 6:30 p.m., January 18th. Please join us, and that will be the last webinar before the hearings. The hearings happen. Of course, we provide the hearing link in the slides and in the talking points, but the hearings begin that next Tuesday in Waymart on January 23rd, and then on January 25th in Philadelphia at the airport Hilton Doubletree Hotel. So neither of those are convenient to get to, which is part of the reason there was such an outcry from the public. But if you can get there, you can still sign up online to get in. I do know that it looks as if all speaking slots may be taken for the afternoon session, but there may still be speaking slots open for the evening session. You had to have signed up by December 31st to speak if you want to be guaranteed a speaking slot. But one of the other things they yielded on, because of our fury over how they set up this unfair, unjust public participation process, is that you can now register at the door and get in. You don't have to have registered by December 31st just to go to the darn hearing. So you can go there at the door and sign up and get in as long as there are seats available. Now, in Philadelphia, the room only holds 300 people. So the afternoon session may very well fill up even for seats, although we're going to try to work something out to rotate people out and get new people in. But the evening session still has a lot of seats available, even in Philadelphia. So if you're in that area, just check online first, because they said they'd be posting 24 hours ahead if there were still seats available. And then if you go and register at the door and get in, if somebody doesn't show up, or if they get to the end of all the speakers and there's still some time left to the 3.5 hours, they're going to let people from the floor speak. So it's really worth going to speak, even if you haven't signed up, because especially if you register online now to get into those hearings. So if you're in Pennsylvania, in the upper part of the watershed, or in New York State, probably the Wayne County hearing is the best for you, and you can sign up for that. There's, again, the first one in the afternoon is pretty full. Whether or not there's any speaking slots left, you know, we don't know yet. Everybody who signed up before December 31st got emails saying that they needed to get back to the DRBC by tomorrow to say whether or not you wanted to speak and which hearing, if you signed up for multiple ones, you actually want to speak at. So you need to send your answer back if you did get that email from the DRBC. But even if you didn't do that, you can still sign up online to attend and then go there and take your chances to speak, because there might be, especially for the evening session, there were not very many people signed up. I mean, this Waymart hearing is way out there in the middle of nowhere, and, you know, in a January night, I doubt there's going to be, and that room is bigger, it's 400 people at least, 400 chairs, and they could probably fit more people in. So I would encourage you to go to that one if you live up that way. And then they added this one hearing. It's in Schnecksville, as I mentioned. It's kind of mind-blowing, again, that there's another one in Pennsylvania. But for folks who live in the Lehigh Valley, you can sign up right now. Go to their link. It's on our Facebook event, which we gave the link to that, and maybe Matt can put that up again, but in the chat box. But go to that link, and there is a link directly to the DRBC, or you can go to the DRBC webpage too, and sign up for that hearing in the Lehigh Valley if you want to. Also, I would suggest that you sign up now if you want to take part in the March 6th telephone session they're going to have, because they probably are going to have a limited number of people that can participate in that. And that one, you know, is one that should, you know, since you're doing it from your phone, anybody from anywhere can sign up. So if you want to attend that, I would say now is the time online to respond and say you want to be on that telephone session. So we're going to be talking again next week about frac waste processing. We'll be going to the hearings, and then we're going to go launch into the next 2 months. We're going to be suggesting comments for every day or every other day. We're going to have suggested comments right up to the end of the time. We'll be talking more about that as we get to it, but this is a very active, dynamic comment process, and we feel it's absolutely essential because of the historic decision that's going to be made here. Are we going to prevent, are we going to take the precautionary approach? Are we going to prevent pollution to our watershed? Are we going to prevent the depletion of our stellar water resources? Are we going to fuel fracking, and we're going to ruin our watershed by inputting toxic, highly toxic frac wastewater? Are we going to ban fracking completely from our watershed? These questions need to be answered the way we want them to be answered. Yes to a ban, and no to any regulations to allow any of the activities related to fracking. So thank you very much, folks, for joining tonight. Look forward to having you join next week and seeing you at the hearings. It's a time when we all can engage and have our actions actually do something. So thank you for engaging and being part of this.